Let's talk about my personal top 5 within $2,500 per pair. Now, this list is my personal top 5. You may completely disagree, but based on about probably over 100 different speakers in this price range, might even be close to like 150 at this point. And in this video, I'm not going to go into the details for my subjective and the objective take. If you want that information, you can find that in the videos for each individual review. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to hit the highlights and try to make it make sense as to why I'm making these recommendations. Before I dive in too far, here's a graphic, because sometimes people say, well, what do you mean when you talk about on axis versus off axis? This is exactly what I mean. On axis would be the speaker pointed directly at you, 0 degrees. Off axis would be anything other than 0 degrees, but in particular, 30 degrees off axis, this is what I'm talking about. First up is the Polk R500 floor standing speaker at $1,300 a pair. Now, this speaker isn't necessarily one of the best ones I reviewed, but I really wanted to put in a floor stander speaker in this particular list that I thought makes sense for a lot of people. Now, most floor standing speakers, you're still going to have to use a subwoofer, and this one's no different. But this one has good linearity on axis and a good listening window with wide soundstage at about plus or minus 70 degrees. The con is that this particular speaker might sound a bit sharp or sibilant. It also has a narrowing horizontal soundstage above 8 kilohertz thanks to the ring radiator tweeter directivity. Vertical positioning really needs to be taken care of here. If you go too far above or below the tweeter line, it's not going to have the same sound. So you're going to make sure that you want to stay within about 10 to 15 degrees of that tweeter axis. I do recommend bringing this speaker out about 1 to 2 feet off the wall. Now, most audiophile types are going to recommend 3 feet or more, or 1 meter or more, for those of you outside of the US. And in this particular case, I recommend bringing these speakers out about 1 to 2 feet off the wall, or 0.3 to 0.6 meters off the rear wall. And I'll show you why in a second. Looking at the CEA 2034 data set, we can see that the sensitivity on average is about 86 decibels or so, and the directivity is pretty good until you get to about 4K or so, where the midwoofer hands off to that tweeter. The estimated in-room response, a couple things I really wanted to note, and for those of you who don't know, or maybe are new to this channel, the estimated in-room response is taken from a conglomeration of actual and anechoic measurements, and you put them together and you say, all right, in a typical room, how is the speaker most likely to sound? In all of my reviews, I've never had a speaker that did not sound similar to the estimated in-room response. And I always listen to speakers and take notes before I measure them and before I look at the measurement. So my correlation between subjective listening notes and actual objective measurement data, especially this one, is pretty much bang on every time. And that's why I put a lot of stock into it personally. You may disagree, but this is based on hundreds of speakers' experience at this point. And so far, I haven't had anything to steer me wrong. So with that said, I wanted to note that resonances can make some voices sound a tad hollow at around 170 hertz. Maybe not a big deal, but just worth pointing out. Peak around 3 to 4 kilohertz will sound shouty. This guy right here, and I'll show you why he occurs in a second. Narrowing high frequency aim on axis. So this black line represents 0 degrees. Remember I showed you black and red earlier? 30 degrees in red is represented right here. If you turn the speaker directly on axis, facing at you, you're going to get this black line response. And the high frequency is going to sound pretty good up until about 16K, then it's going to roll off. The high frequency, when the speaker is turned away from you, is going to start diverging at around 6 kilohertz or so. And it's going to be about 2 to 3 decibels different than it is when it's pointed directly at you if you point it off axis. So if you point it out into the room, those high frequencies are going to drop off pretty quickly. The horizontal radiation. This is basically like if you took a bird's eye view and then squashed everything together to see what the radiation of the speaker is, this is what you would get. So 0 degrees right here is the tweeter axis. So what I've said is it's about plus or minus 70 degrees based on this negative 6 decibel point right here. And this kind of gives us an idea of like how wide is the radiation, okay? About plus or minus 70 degrees. But notice that in horizontal terms, the tweeter starts to narrow up pretty quickly. And that's why I said you want to point this tweeter directly at the listening position. Don't toe it out, toe it in toward you. Vertical dispersion is pretty limited at about plus or minus 15 degrees. So again, sit at the tweeter axis. I also wanted to point out something about this particular speaker in relation to room acoustics and absorption panels. Now, in my opinion, if you have a good speaker, you don't need a lot of absorption. You don't really need to fix the speaker with absorption. Fixing the room is a different thing, but fixing the speaker with absorption is something else altogether. However, there are cases where a speaker can benefit from a little bit of absorption, or conversely, you can use EQ. Unfortunately, with this particular speaker, you can't use EQ because what happens is, as that mid range is handing off to that tweeter, that mid range is getting more narrow. And as that tweeter comes in, that tweeter is very broad. So if you wanted to say, hey, 4 to 5 kilohertz sounds a bit shouty, I'm going to EQ that down. Well, you're EQing that down for all axes. But the problem is that it's not all axes that suffer. It's really as you go off axis. Listening to the speaker directly on axis has a good neutral sound. Listening to the speaker off axis has a more elevated 4 to 5 kilohertz area where it's going to sound a little bit more sibilant and a little bit more sharp. So you can't just EQ that to fix that. So what do? In this particular case, you can use acoustic absorption on the sidewalls. And I would recommend you doing so at about 40 to 60 degrees off axis from the speaker, or relative to your listening position. So if the speaker is facing you, make sure whatever is off axis of that speaker at about 40 to 60 degrees is where you place that acoustic absorption. What that is going to do is that is going to capture this stuff right here. It's going to lessen its output. So it's not going to hit the hard walls of your room and reflect back at you higher in intensity. Instead, it's going to be absorbed. So in your listening position, it won't sound like it's shrill or sharp or sibilant in that particular area. It's going to sound more smooth. If you place that panel within, let's say, 10 degrees to 30 degrees of that first bounce angle, then you're going to wind up absorbing the high frequency stuff. And you don't want to do that because it's already narrow enough as it is. You just want to focus on this 40 to 60 degree window right through here, capture that first reflection at that particular angle, and you'll be good. Number 4 on my list is the Wharfedale Aura 2, priced at $2,500 per pair without stands. And all the speakers I'm talking about are going to be without stands. This speaker has a lot of things going for it that I really like. It has great linearity. It has great in-room response. Low-end extension could warrant not using a subwoofer, and it has a wide soundstage. On the flip side, vertically, because it uses an AMT tweeter, it's going to narrow up in the vertical region faster than a typical dome tweeter will. Now that's in relation to the radiating surface. So if it were squished down even more, then it wouldn't narrow up as quickly. But because it's so tall relative to its width, it's going to narrow up in the vertical domain more quickly, which means that you're going to need to sit within a pretty tight window of the tweeter's axis, which is going to be like maybe plus or minus 10 degrees. The mid bass in this speaker is a little bit lower in sensitivity than the mid range and the high frequency. And for that reason, I would recommend putting this speaker a little bit closer to the wall as well. If you put it about 1 to 2 feet or 0.3 to 0.6 meters away from the back wall, that'll help bring up that mid bass and make it more neutral sounding overall. The on-axis response in black, again, see how this is around 86 or so decibels on average, 86 and a half. But then you got from below about maybe 200 hertz or so, it kind of dips down. That's why I recommend putting it near a wall. The early reflections directivity index is incredible. The estimated in-room response for this also looks fantastic. Notice that 30 degrees and 0 degrees in black are pretty much the same. They're within about half a decibel or so of each other. Horizontal radiation at about plus or minus 70 degrees. Vertical dispersion is limited. And notice how limited this is. It's within about maybe 15 degrees or so. A typical dome tweeter doesn't do that, but this is a kind of response that you get from a ribbon or an AMT tweeter just because it's taller in nature. That's not always the case for those of you who are like micro correcting me. Number 3 on my list is the Wharfedale Linton 85th Anniversary Edition. This is one of my favorite speakers. Retails for about $1,500 a pair. Very neutral, except it does have a dip around 1 kilohertz, which is intentional. It has very wide soundstage at about plus or minus 70 degrees. Low-end extension could also warrant not using a subwoofer. The vertical positioning is pretty tight at the crossover, so you'll need to be within about 10 degrees of the tweeter level to get the same tonality. I also would recommend bringing this speaker out at least 2 feet or 0.6 meters from the wall. Putting it closer to the wall, I think, will make the bass sound a little bit too boomy. And then I would recommend turning the speaker about 10 degrees off axis, and I'll show you why here. On-axis response looks pretty good. There's a mild dip between 2 to 4 kilohertz. Not a big deal. I mean, that's maybe half a decibel to a decibel. Not a big deal. Low end looks pretty good. Early reflections directivity, yeah, could use some work. A lot of this is due to diffraction. And I also want to note with this particular speaker, make sure that you listen to it with the grill on, because that is how it is designed to be listened to critically. Okay. The estimated inner response looks really good. Smooth roll off to about 40 hertz, where the faster rate of roll off occurs. And that's why I say you could probably get by without having to use a subwoofer for this speaker. Dip around 1K can lose some attack or clarity. And then also the high frequency has a slight upward tilt directly on axis. So if I go back here, you can see this is what I'm talking about, this little upward kick. So if you toe it off by about maybe 10 degrees, maybe 30 degrees, you're going to get rid of that little upward kick, and it's going to sound more neutral overall. Horizontal radiation, you can see this about plus or minus 70 degrees. Vertically, it is limited. I'd say you're within about maybe, I don't know, plus or minus 15 degrees, give or take. Now we're going to get into my top two. Again, these are just my personal rankings, okay? You can disagree all you want, and that is fine. It's just audio. We don't have to hate each other because we don't share the same opinion. Entering in at number 2 is the KEF R3 Meta. And some of you may be surprised. You may be thinking, how is that not number 1? Erin loves KEF stuff. Well, you're going to see why in a second, but it's still a fantastic speaker. Retails for about $2,300 a pair. Extremely neutral sounding speaker. It benefits from being placed close to the wall, and I'll show you why shortly. Excellent low distortion, and it is a point source with very even dispersion horizontally and vertically. And the and vertically part really matters. That's what separates this speaker from the others that I've already talked about. 2 cons with this speaker. One is it's going to need a subwoofer. And the other is, and this is a personal thing, it's more narrow in the soundstage radiation than I personally care for. If this thing were like a little bit wider, then it might even shift up to number 1 for me. But because it's a little bit more limited and restricted in its horizontal dispersion, that's why it's at number 2 instead of number 1. My recommendation for the speaker will be to point it about 10 degrees off axis and put it close to the wall within about a foot if possible. So let's talk about why. This is the 10 degrees off axis response. Okay. And if you want to see 0, it's on my website. It's in my other review. I'm not going to talk about that here. It doesn't really change a lot other than the diffraction issues pop up at 0 degrees. So that's why I recommend 10 degrees. And that's pretty typical for concentric or coaxial designs. Average sensitivity is about 86 decibels or so, and it looks really smooth. Now see this guy right here. That's interesting. Hang on. Early reflections directivity looks really good. There's some element of here. It looks like maybe diffraction. I'm not 100% sure without digging into this a little bit more, at around 2.5 kilohertz. But otherwise, this speaker takes very, very well to equalization. Okay, so let's talk about this knee first and the estimated in-room response. Estimated in-room response, 0 and 10 degrees in this graphic. I couldn't find my original 0 and 30, but 10 degrees is my recommendation anyway, so we're going to stick with that. On the low end, see how this kind of comes down and then kicks back up? That's what's called an extended bass shelf response. Typically, a sealed subwoofer, or a sealed enclosure, I should say, is going to just kind of start rolling off at about 12 dB per octave. When you port an enclosure, you have different options for tuning that port. And one of them would be this, where you port it and you tune it a little bit lower than the natural roll off might be. And in doing so, what you do is you hit both the natural roll off, kind of like a sealed enclosure. And then before you get too low, you come back up, you flatten out a little bit to give you just a little bit more extension. Why would you want that? You would want that because you can place these speakers closer to a wall without having a lot of boomy sound. So if I take my voice and I start putting it closer to the wall, and as I get it closer to my hand, you can see that the voice is starting to change. It's starting to sound a little bit more boomy and boomy and boomy. Okay? Most audiophile type speakers are designed to be brought out from the wall at least like 2 feet. But not everybody's lifestyle consists of a way to do that. So putting this speaker closer to the wall with this particular knee and the roll-off won't combine with a boomy, bassy effect. Instead, it's going to sound a little bit more smooth. You're going to gain a little bit more extension right through here. So it's going to have a better roll-off when it's placed close to the wall, as opposed to being out in free space like this graphic would show you. The other thing is the high frequency does have a slight upward tilt directly on axis, and it's more neutral with the 10-degree toe angle. So that's why I recommend 10 degrees for this particular speaker. Horizontal radiation at the -6 dB line, or the higher frequency at least, is about plus or minus 50 degrees. It's a little bit narrow for my liking. I tend to find plus or minus 60 degrees is closer to what I prefer. I mean, speakers are a combination of a lot of trade-offs, right? So that's the one trade-off for me that this speaker has that I wish were a little bit different, but overall, it's still a fantastic speaker. And if you have a very lively room, like Say you got these speakers really close to a wall, or you've got them in a very, there's glass around or there's mirrors around. And it's just a very lively, echoey room. Having a speaker with more narrow radiation can help combat some of that poor room characteristic. And so in doing so, you have a little bit more freedom with this particular speaker and you don't have to deal with such a lively room. Whereas speakers that have wider radiation, they may sound more diffuse. They may sound too echoey. They may have some negative characteristics that you don't like. So that's why you would tend to kind of balance out wide versus narrow radiation. And that is why I often recommend, listen, narrow it down to like 3 different speakers. And if you can, go demo them or order them from somewhere that has a good return policy and listen to them in your room and then make that final decision. The data isn't the final arbiter here. The data is just to help you get down to a point that you make a reasonable conclusion, and then you order maybe 1, 2, 3 pair of speakers based off of that, and then you keep the one you like the most. Vertically, plus or minus 50 degrees. You've seen all the other ones are like maybe 10, 15 degrees at most, right? So that means when you stand up from that tweeter line or whatever that reference axis is with those other speakers, now all of a sudden, and vocal intelligibility is gone, attack's gone, certain characteristics of the sound are just gone. It doesn't sound the same as you're walking around the room. That may not be a big deal to you. You may sit with your head in a vise at the exact same height all the time. But for somebody like me who has their living room and their kitchen combined, I'm often watching a lot of television or maybe listening to music while I'm cooking or doing other things. And I like the benefit of having even dispersion vertically as high as I can get it. This particular speaker goes up to plus or minus 50 degrees, and that's what sets it apart from the other speakers. And number 1 on my list, maybe no surprise to some of you, especially if you see the thumbnail, but it is the MoFi SourcePoint 8. Currently on sale for about $2,000 a pair. This is my favorite speaker in this price range. And the reason for that is it combines good linearity with good in-room response and wide dispersion at about plus or minus 60 degrees, both horizontally and vertically. That is the main selling feature for me to get the MoFi SourcePoint 8 over the KEF. Now, you may disagree again, and that's fine, but I'm just relaying that's the number 1 feature that I like the most when I'm looking at those two. The potential downsides for the speaker are that it does need to be brought out from the wall. You don't want to put this right next to the wall. It doesn't have that extended base shelf or that knee like the KEF has. And when it does hit its roll-off point, it rolls off pretty quickly. So it's going to need a subwoofer. Looking at the response at plus or minus 15 degrees, you can see that it's pretty linear. If you're wondering where 0 degrees is and you're crying foul, hey, all the data, all that stuff is covered in my other review. You'll understand why if you watch that. But basically, as I said with the KEF, most concentric coaxial drivers are better positioned off axis. And this particular speaker works best at about plus or minus 15 degrees, at least according to my ears. Once you get down to the bass, though, see how this rolls off pretty quickly? That's the one con that this speaker has. I think this one probably has the least amount of bass out of all the ones on this list. So you almost certainly are going to have a subwoofer. That's being resolved with the new MoFi SourcePoint 888. Early reflections directivity looks pretty good. There are some little diffraction bounces here or there. Not a big deal. I'm not too worried about that. Estimated in-room response looks great. The kicker for me, horizontal radiation at about plus or minus 60 degrees. That's nice. Vertical radiation, pretty much the same thing, about plus or minus 60 degrees. And that does it for my personal top 5 under $2,500. If you feel like I've left something out, I probably did, and I probably did it on purpose because I can't make this video 50 minutes long. If you want to see the entire reviews, please go watch those individually. I have a lot more information in those, but I kind of wanted to give you an idea of not just what I like the most, but why I like the most. So hopefully this gives you something to go on. If you're interested in buying any of these speakers that I've talked about, please consider using my affiliate links. I'm not telling you have to. I mean, if you think affiliate links are the devil, that's fine. But if you're going to buy something, then I might as well say, hey, here's an affiliate link if you don't mind using it. That earns me a small commission at no additional cost to you and allows me to keep doing what I'm doing. And I really do appreciate that. Alternatively, you can join me at patreon.com/Erin's Audio Corner, where I post a lot of behind the scenes. I've been lately posting update videos and things like that. And once I get my Clipple back up and running, you'll see a lot more content on there soon. I promise you guys. I promise. Trust me. I'm hurting just as bad as you are. I'm like a data junkie right now. I need more speakers to measure. I love it. All right. With that said, that's it for me. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below and I will answer them as best I can. And I will talk to y'all later. Take care. Peace.